The door nearly came off its hinges. Matthew Dawson's fist connected with the weathered wood so hard that the whole frame shuddered, dust falling from the rafters in pale curtains, and the woman on the other side of that door went completely still. He could hear her through the planks, the sudden cease of movement, the suspended breath, and it only made the fury burning in his chest run hotter. "I know you're in there," he said, and his voice came out low and dangerous, the way it did when he was one word away from something irreversible. "Open this door. Right now." A pause, then the scrape of a latch. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not what he expected. He had built a picture of her during the 3-mile ride from his main house. Some brazen opportunist, someone calculating, someone who understood exactly what she was doing when she rolled her wagon onto land that belonged to him and started unloading like she owned the deed. He had built a picture of hardness and defiance, and the picture had been wrong. Lucy Keller was perhaps 26 years old, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and fell in a heavy wave across one shoulder. There was a smudge of dust on her cheek. Her dress was the dark gray of half-mourning, not fresh black, which meant the loss was not recent but not so far gone that she had fully released the habit of grief. Her eyes were brown and steady, and they looked directly at him with a composure that somehow made him angrier because he had expected her to flinch and she did not. In her right hand she held a cast-iron skillet. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "you know who I am. I made inquiries before I arrived." She did not lower the skillet. "I assumed you would come. Then you know what I'm here to say. You're here to tell me to leave." She tilted her head slightly. "This is your land, that cabin belongs to you. I have no business being here, and if I don't vacate voluntarily you'll involve the county sheriff, whose name is Gerald Briggs and who, I understand, owes you 3 years of favors, a beat." Did I miss anything? The accuracy of it stopped him for just a moment, which he resented. "How did you get in?" he asked. "The lock was broken. I fixed it." "You broke my lock to get in and then fixed it." "I didn't break it. It was already broken when I arrived." "Probably has been for years, given the rust on the mechanism. I simply replaced it with a functioning one." She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small key, which she held out to him between 2 fingers. "This is yours if you want it. I have a copy." Matthew stared at the key. He stared at Lucy Keller. He stared at the cabin behind her, the one his father had built 40 years ago and that had stood empty for the last 3, since the hired hand who last lived in it had moved on, and he felt something complicated beginning to form in the back of his mind, something that wasn't entirely made of anger. He had come out here to object. He had come to remove her. He had come with the full, righteous certainty of a man whose property had been trespassed upon, whose boundaries had been crossed, whose orderly, solitary life had been disrupted by a widow in a gray dress with a cast-iron skillet and steady brown eyes. He had not come to feel anything other than justified. But she was still holding out that key, patient as stone, and there was something in the set of her jaw that he recognized the way a man recognizes an old wound in another person, not because they told you about it, but because you carry the same shape of it yourself. He did not take the key. He said, "Where did you come from?" And that was the moment, though neither of them knew it yet, when the course of everything changed. 3 weeks earlier, Lucy Keller had buried the last of her problems in the dry earth of a small town called Redding's Crossing, 40 miles east of where she now stood. The problem's name had been Frank Harlow, and he had not been her husband, though for 14 terrible months he had controlled nearly everything that touched her life. Her husband had died first. James Keller, 32 years old, had been thrown from his horse on a cold November morning in 1882 and had not survived the fall. He and Lucy had been married 4 years, had built a modest but real life together on a small cattle operation in the Eastern Territories, and his death had left her with a house, a deed she didn't fully understand, 2 horses, and a grief so vast she could barely breathe through it. Frank Harlow had presented himself as a solution. He was James's business partner, or rather, he had called himself that, though Lucy later learned the partnership had been one-sided in nearly every legal and financial sense. He was 41 years old, well-dressed, and spoke with the kind of patient authority that people in grief tend to mistake for competence. He had sat across from her at her own kitchen table and explained, with seemingly great regret, that James had owed him a considerable sum, that the deed to the property was in both their names due to a contract she hadn't known existed, and that he was prepared to be generous in how they resolved the matter. What followed was 14 months of a hidden trap she hadn't recognized as a trap until she was fully inside it. He didn't marry her. He made that clear from the beginning in a way that was almost worse. She was not a wife. She was a liability he was managing. He moved into the house with 2 of his men and called it protection. He made decisions about the cattle operation and called them management. He controlled the money and called it oversight. And he reminded her regularly that his name was on the deed, and that if she made things difficult, the sheriff, a man thoroughly in his pocket, would see things his way. Lucy was not stupid. She was not passive. But she was alone, and she was in grief, and she was in a territory where a woman without male kin had very few options and even fewer people who would believe her word over Frank Harlow's. What she had was patience and precision, and the willingness to wait for the exact right moment. The moment came when Harlow made a mistake. He got drunk and loud in the saloon of Redding's Crossing and bragged to the wrong man, a traveling land surveyor named Abe Collins, about how he'd acquired a nice little cattle operation without paying a cent for it. Collins, it turned out, had a sister who had been similarly swindled by a similar man in another territory, and Collins had opinions about such behavior. He also had professional access to county land records. What Collins found when he looked, and what he brought to the circuit judge who came through Redding's Crossing 6 weeks later, was that the contract Harlow had shown Lucy was a forgery. James Keller had never signed anything making Frank Harlow a co-owner of the property. The debt itself was fabricated. The trial was brief. The verdict was clear. Frank Harlow went to jail, and Lucy Keller got her deed back, and then she stood in the house where she had spent 14 months as a prisoner of a different man's plans, and she felt it clearly. She could not stay here. Every board of this floor held a memory she did not want to keep. The town of Redding's Crossing knew her now as the woman Harlow had used, and she could feel the weight of that knowledge in every set of eyes that found her on the street. She sold the cattle at fair market price. She sold the house to a young couple who had just arrived from the East and who didn't know the story of the walls. She kept the 2 horses and the wagon and a sum of money that was modest but real, and she pointed herself west. She had heard about the cabin at the edge of Matthew Dawson's property from a woman in a dry goods store in the town of Millhaven, which was the closest settlement to the Dawson ranch. The woman, a talkative, generous soul named Berta Walsh, who ran the store with her husband, had mentioned offhand that there was an empty cabin on the Dawson land that the man never used, had never rented out, just let sit there going slowly back to the earth. "Why doesn't he rent it?" Lucy had asked. Berta Walsh had given her a look that was equal parts sympathy and complicated history. "Matthew Dawson doesn't much care for company," she said. "Hasn't since his wife passed." Lucy had noted the information and made her decision. She was not naive about what she was doing. She was choosing to occupy land that wasn't hers and to hope that the man who owned it would be persuadable once she was already there, already settled, already a fact rather than a request. She knew it was forward. She knew it was legally tenuous. She was past the point of being troubled by forward or legally tenuous. She had watched the legal system both fail her and save her, and she understood that it was a tool, not a guarantee, and that sometimes a woman had to make her own position before she could negotiate from it. So she arrived on a Tuesday in late April of 1883, found the lock broken as she'd told Matthew, replaced it with one from her wagon, and began unpacking. She had been there 3 days when he came. "I came from Redding's Crossing," she said, answering his question in the doorway, her voice careful and even. Before that, from Missouri originally. I've been widowed 2 years." Matthew's expression was still closed, still guarded, but she watched his eyes move to the gray of her dress, then back to her face, then past her into the cabin, where her things sat in various states of arrangement. She had been here 3 days, and she had made it, she realized, rather noticeably livable. There was a braided rug on the floor, a set of curtains at the window, a row of books on the shelf. The cast iron stove was burning, and something was simmering on top of it that smelled of dried herbs and salt. "That's my property," he said, but the heat in his voice had changed quality. It was still firm, but it had lost its edge of pure outrage, and she could feel him thinking. "I know," she said. "I'd like to rent it from you. I have money. I can pay what's fair." She kept her eyes on his because she had learned in the last 2 years that looking away was the same as conceding, and she was done conceding things she didn't have to. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Dawson. I'm here because I needed somewhere to be, and this cabin needed someone to be in it, and I thought those two facts might be able to reach an agreement." He was quiet for a long moment. The evening light was coming down golden through the cottonwood trees at the edge of the property, and somewhere behind him, a mockingbird was running through its inventory of stolen songs. "You thought," he repeated. "I thought." Another silence. Then Matthew Dawson did something she hadn't entirely predicted. He looked away from her and out at the prairie, and she saw something move across his face that was not anger and was not calculation, but was something older and quieter and harder to name. "You broke the window latch on the south side," he said. "It was already broken. I can see it from here." "It's on my list," she said. He looked back at her. "What list?" "The list of things that need fixing in this cabin." She pushed the door open wider without stepping back from it, which was deliberate. "The window latch on the south side. A loose board in the floor near the stove. The chimney flashing is pulling away from the roof on the left side. That'll cause problems when the rains come. The well rope is frayed. Someone needs to reseal the door frame before winter." His jaw shifted. "How do you know all that?" "I've been here 3 days," she said. "I walked through everything. I look at things carefully." She paused. "I've had to." Something about the way she said that last part seemed to land. She hadn't meant it as a plea. She wasn't capable of that anymore, hadn't been since Harlow taught her that showing need was the same as handing someone a weapon. But she also hadn't entirely hidden what it carried, and Matthew Dawson was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said finally. It was not what she expected. For what purpose? To look at the chimney flashing. He said it like it was entirely practical, like it was the most unremarkable statement a man could make. "If it's pulling away like you say, it needs mortar and a receipt before the roof frame takes any water damage." Lucy looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a yes to the rental." "No," he said, "it's not. But it's not a no." He was already turning back toward the horse he had tied to the fence post, a big gray animal that watched the proceedings with apparent disinterest. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up in one practiced motion. "Be up early," he said. "I start before dawn." She watched him ride back toward the main house, which sat perhaps 3 miles across the open grassland, its windows just beginning to catch the last of the evening light. She stood in the doorway of the cabin until he was a dark shape in the distance, and then she went back inside and stood by the stove and let herself feel, just for a moment, the specific texture of what had just happened. He had not made her leave. He had said he would come back. He had said it in the language of a man who fixes things, which she recognized as its own kind of language, and she filed it carefully away. She took the cast iron skillet off her shoulder, where she had been holding it this entire time without fully realizing it, and set it on the stove, and then she laughed, a small, private sound that came out before she could stop it. Matthew Dawson rode back to his main house in the descending dark and tried to understand what had happened. He was 34 years old, and he had owned this land for 6 years, since his father died and left it to him. Before that he had worked it alongside his father, and before that, in the years that felt like they belonged to a different man entirely, He had worked a smaller piece of land 50 miles north with a woman named Clara, who had been his wife for 3 years before a fever took her in the winter of 1879. Clara's death was the dark past that shaped everything after it. It was the reason he had sold the northern property and come south to take over his father's ranch. It was the reason the hired hand's cabin sat empty rather than occupied. He had stopped hiring men who would live on the property, because living on the property meant proximity, and proximity meant knowing someone, and knowing someone meant risking the particular devastation that came when you lost them. He knew this about himself. He was not blind to it. He had arranged his life to minimize that risk, and the arrangement had worked reasonably well for 4 years. He had ranch hands who came in from Millhaven for the work and went home at night. He had a cook named Hector who was 58 years old and had been with the family since before Matthew was born, who lived in a small room off the kitchen and counted as furniture rather than a person who might be lost. He had land and cattle and work, which was enough, which had to be enough, which he told himself was enough so often and with such repetition that most days he almost believed it. And then a widow with steady brown eyes and a cast iron skillet had moved into his cabin. He unsaddled the gray horse, whose name was Jefferson, in the barn, working by lantern light with the efficient, automatic movements of a man who has done something 10,000 times. He thought about the list she had rattled off: window latch, floor board, chimney flashing, well-roped door frame. She hadn't said it like a complaint. She had said it like a person who looks at broken things and sees the work required to fix them, without drama, without blame. He had the irritating sense that she was more practical about the state of his own property than he had been. He hadn't been out to the cabin in over a year. He knew it was in some state of disrepair. He had told himself he'd get to it. He hadn't gotten to it. He went inside and ate the dinner Hector had left on the stove: beef and beans, which was what Hector made on Tuesdays. And he sat at the big kitchen table and thought about the gray dress and what it meant that she was still wearing it 2 years in. And he thought about the way she had said, "I've had to." And he thought about the key she had held out between 2 fingers like an offering that was also a boundary. He told himself he would go back in the morning, assess the chimney flashing, and then firmly and clearly tell her that she needed to find other accommodations. He would be fair. He would give her a week. He would not be unreasonable about it. He did not entirely believe himself, but he went to bed anyway. He was at the cabin by the time the first gray light came up over the eastern hills, which meant he had ridden out before sunrise, which was not exactly what he had told himself he would do. He had brought tools: a short-handled trowel, a bag of mortar, a length of new rope for the well. Lucy Keller opened the door before he could knock, which meant she had been awake and watching from the window, and she was already dressed, her hair pinned up, a cup of coffee in each hand. She held one out to him. He took it without comment. It was good coffee, dark and strong, and that was annoying in a way he couldn't exactly justify. "Ladder's in the barn," he said, "around the back." "I'll get it," she said, "I'll get it. I'm already standing here." They looked at each other for a moment, and then he walked around the side of the cabin toward the barn, which was small and leaning slightly but structurally intact, and she followed him without being asked, and he found this not as irritating as he expected. They got the ladder together. It was a long, heavy thing, and it made more practical sense for 2 people to carry it, and he allowed himself to admit that without making anything of it. Up on the roof, he found the chimney flashing in exactly the state she had described, the mortar crumbling at the left seam, the flashing pulling back 2 inches, water damage already beginning in the wood beneath. If it had gone another winter untended, it would have meant rot in the roof frame, which would have meant serious structural problems. He cleaned out the old mortar, reseated the flashing, applied new mortar carefully along the seam, and did it in a focused silence that he was comfortable with. Below him, he could hear Lucy Keller doing something at the well, and when he came down the ladder an hour later she had replaced the frayed rope with a new one. She had her own supplies, apparently from her wagon, and was testing the bucket mechanism with focused efficiency. He stood at the foot of the ladder and watched her and felt something odd, which was something close to recognition. "The rope was easy," she said, not looking up. "The bucket pulley needs oil, but I didn't have any." "I do," he said, and went back to his saddlebag. They worked like that through the morning, him on one repair, her on another, trading tools and supplies with minimal conversation that nevertheless had a rhythm to it, a kind of unspoken coordination that Matthew found both comfortable and slightly alarming. He was used to working alone. He was good at it. But working alongside someone who moved through a task with the same quiet purposefulness he used himself felt, unexpectedly, more natural than it should have. He fixed the floorboard near the stove while she reseated the window latch on the south side. She had a small toolkit of her own, not extensive but practical. A hammer, a set of chisels, pliers, a level. The level surprised him. "Where did you learn carpentry?" he asked before he decided whether to ask it. She was fitting the new latch into the window frame with the careful attention of someone who has learned to do things right the first time. "My father," she said. "He believed women should know how to maintain a house properly, not just inhabit it." A pause. "He was ahead of his time in some ways." "In some ways," Matthew repeated. "Not all ways." She secured the latch and tested it. "He still thought my highest aspiration should be a good marriage." Matthew was quiet for a moment, pressing the floorboard back into alignment with the flat of his hand. "And was it a good marriage?" The question was more personal than he had intended. He heard it hang in the air between them and waited for her to decide how to answer it, or whether to answer it. "It was a real one," she said finally. "James was a good man. We were honest with each other. I think that's the most you can ask." "Yes," Matthew said, and the single syllable came out with more weight than he intended. She looked at him then briefly from across the small room. He looked back. Something passed between them, not words, not even meaning exactly, but the mutual recognition of people who have been through loss and carry it the same way, quietly and permanently, and without expecting anyone else to fully understand it. He looked back down at the floorboard. They ate lunch together, which had not been planned. She had bread and smoked meat from her supplies, and he had nothing, having ridden out before Hector was up, and she produced 2 plates without asking, and he sat down at her table, which had been his table technically, before she brought it back to life with a cloth and a vase of early wildflowers, and they ate the bread and smoked meat and did not speak very much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. He went home that evening without having told her to leave. He went back the next day. He told himself it was because the door frame still needed resealing before the weather turned, which was true. He told himself it was a matter of protecting his property value, which was also technically true. He did not tell himself anything about the coffee she handed him at the door, or about the particular quality of attention she gave to problems. The way she looked at a broken thing with a kind of steady, unemotional assessment that he recognized as the look of someone who has learned that panic is useless. Or about the fact that when he rode away from the cabin in the evenings he felt, in a way he had not felt in 4 years, that there was something on this land that was alive in a way it hadn't been. Over the following 2 weeks, a routine established itself with the quiet inevitability of water finding a path downhill. He came in the mornings. There was coffee. There was work. She had a list, and the list grew as they worked through it, and she found new things that needed attention: a gap in the barn wall that let the wind in, a section of fence post that had rotted through, the rusted hinges on the root cellar door that she had found half hidden under a growth of creeping vines. He noticed, carefully, and with a growing sense of something he wasn't quite ready to name, that she approached every task with a thoroughness that went beyond what was strictly necessary. She didn't just fix the gap in the barn wall. She found where the water was tracking in and redirected the drainage so it wouldn't happen again. She didn't just replace the fence post. She walked the entire fence line and marked 2 others that were beginning to go soft. She seemed, constitutionally, unable to do a half job. "You're going to work yourself through the whole property," he said one afternoon, watching her pull the rusted hinges off the root cellar door with a pair of pliers. The root cellar needs to be accessible, she said. If I'm going to put up preserves this summer, I need to be able to get in and out without the door jamming on me. You're planning to be here this summer, he said. She stopped working and looked up at him. You still haven't given me an answer about the rental. No. It's been 2 weeks, Matthew. He noticed he was very careful to notice that she had started using his first name somewhere in the second week, and he had started using hers, and neither of them had commented on it, which was itself a kind of comment. What are you asking for it? He said. The rent. She had a number ready. She always had things ready. She had thought about it in advance clearly, had priced it against the going rate for comparable properties in the county. It was fair. It was more than fair, actually. It was slightly above what he might have asked, which he suspected was intentional, because she had worked out that charging him above market rate removed any argument he might make about whether the arrangement was equitable. He said, "That's reasonable." "I think so. First month in advance. I can do that." She held out her hand across the open root cellar door, and he shook it, and the handshake was brief and businesslike and left him feeling, when she released his hand, like something had shifted in the center of his chest. He rode home that evening and sat on his porch until it was fully dark and told himself, very clearly and with great deliberateness, that Lucy Keller was his tenant. She was a respectable widow managing her own affairs. She was practical and capable and did not require anything from him except what their arrangement called for. She was not a person to develop feelings about. He sat there for a long time. Millhaven was a proper town of modest ambitions, sitting at the intersection of 2 wagon roads in the open grassland 30 miles from the New Mexico border. It had a general store, which was Berta Walsh's domain. It had a post office, a small church, a saloon called the Red Drum that tried to maintain a certain dignity and mostly succeeded, a blacksmith, a doctor who came through on a circuit every 3 weeks, and about 250 permanent residents who knew each other's business with the comprehensive thoroughness of people who have very few other forms of entertainment. Lucy discovered this when she rode into town for supplies at the end of her second week, and found that she was already known. Berta Walsh greeted her at the door of the general store with genuine warmth and an expression that was doing its best to not look like naked curiosity. "Mrs. Keller, I heard you settled out at the Dawson place. The whole town has been talking about it." "Has it?" Lucy said. "Oh, don't worry, it's not ill." Berta was already moving behind the counter, pulling out her order book. "People are just interested. Matthew Dawson hasn't let anyone on that property in years. Some folks thought the cabin had ghosts." "I haven't seen any," Lucy said. Berta laughed. "What do you need?" She filled her order: flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, a new block of beeswax. And while Berta wrapped the parcels, she met 3 other women who came into the store in the way that people come into a general store in a small town, which is to say not entirely by coincidence. There was Eleanor Briggs, the sheriff's wife, who was formidably pleasant and asked how Lucy found the cabin. There was a young woman named Dottie Park, who had a baby on her hip and smiled with enormous openness. And there was a lean, watchful woman named Cora Weston, who owned a small horse operation at the north end of town, and who looked at Lucy with the steady, assessing look of someone deciding whether to form an opinion. "You're the one who moved into Dawson's cabin," Cora said. It was not a question. "I am," Lucy said. "He let you stay. We reached an agreement." Cora was quiet for a moment, doing the same kind of assessment Lucy had seen Matthew do, looking at her straight, measuring something about what she saw. Then she nodded once, the compact nod of a person who has decided in your favor. "He's a decent man," she said. "Private as a sealed vault, but decent." She picked up her order from the counter. "You'll do all right out there if you're the type to manage on your own." "I am," Lucy said. Cora almost smiled. "I can see that," she said, and left. The spring deepened into May, and May warmed toward June, and the mornings on the high plains turned from cool to merely temperate to the first reaching fingers of real summer heat. The work on the cabin had been substantially completed by the end of the 3rd week. They had worked through Lucy's list methodically, and what remained was small and manageable, and Matthew's visits no longer had the pretense of repairs to justify them. He still came. He would arrive in the mornings, not every day but most days, and there would be coffee, and they would find things to do or talk about or simply be present for. He helped her get her small kitchen garden started, a 20-foot plot behind the cabin that she had marked out and begun to break up with a mattock. The soil out here was rocky and resistant, and the work was hard, and he came alongside her one morning and picked up a second mattock from the barn without asking, and they worked the plot together in a silence that was by now familiar and comfortable in a way that Matthew kept trying not to examine too directly. She told him about James, not the detail of the loss itself that she kept at some distance, still, but about who James had been, a man who laughed easily, a man who read books and could quote them, a man who had believed in the cattle operation with a kind of honest optimism that made him good to be around even when things were hard. She did not tell him about Frank Harlow. Not yet. She was not ready to hand that particular weight to someone she was still, in some ways, learning the shape of. Matthew told her about the ranch, the history of it, his father's history, the way the land had been in the family for 2 generations and the weight of that continuity. He talked about cattle with the fluency of a man who thinks in those terms, explaining the decisions he made about breeding and grazing and the management of the water on the property with a thoughtfulness she found compelling. He was not a man who did things carelessly. He talked about Clara only once briefly, and it was not in response to a question but because the moment opened for it. They had been working in the garden and she had found a small piece of glazed pottery in the soil, the bottom of a broken cup, and had brushed it off and held it up. That was probably hers, he said, and his voice had the particular flatness of something being held carefully still. Your wife? Lucy asked. She used to bring coffee out to the hand sometimes. He looked at the piece of pottery for a moment. She liked this kind of work, garden work. I'm sorry, Lucy said. It was 4 years ago. He said it in the way people say things that are both true and not entirely the point. 4 years is still not very long, she said. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the steady brown eyes and the expression she wore when she was saying something honest, and he felt the truth of it settle in him like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples spreading outward in all directions. No, he said, it's not. The summer arrived with full intensity in late June, bringing with it the smell of dry grass and the sound of cicadas from first light to last dark, and the particular quality of high plains heat that presses down on a person with physical weight. Lucy kept her kitchen garden going with water hauled from the well, watching the tomatoes and bean plants climb toward the sun with a patient satisfaction she hadn't felt about anything in a long time. Matthew brought her a load of firewood in the first week of June, citing the coming winter in a practical tone, and then helped her stack it against the cabin's north wall in a way that would give the most protection from the wind. Hector sent cornbread with him, wrapped in a cloth. The old cook had apparently taken an interest in Lucy without having met her, on the strength of Matthew's descriptions of the situation, which Matthew had kept carefully factual and from which Hector had clearly drawn his own conclusions. Tell him thank you, Lucy said, eating the cornbread on the porch steps while Matthew finished the stacking. He'll come out and meet you himself one of these days, Matthew said. He's been threatening to. I'd like that. He came and sat on the steps beside her, and they sat in the shade of the cabin's small porch roof in the midday heat and ate cornbread and drank water from the well and didn't say much. This had become one of the patterns of their time together, the productive silences, the comfortable proximity, the absence of the need to perform conversation. Lucy was used to needing to fill silence because silence had felt like danger in the Harlow period. The fact that silence with Matthew felt like rest was something she noticed with a wondering, slightly wary gratitude. She was aware of him. She had been aware of him in that particular way since about the 3rd or 4th day, if she was honest with herself, which she tried always to be. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moved with the economy of a man who has done physical work his whole life. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that were sometimes very warm and sometimes very distant. And the distance, she understood now, was not coldness, but the particular habit of a private man who had learned to lock down hard when things became too much. She recognized the habit because she had something similar in herself. She was also aware, with a precision that was partly self-protective, that she was in a complicated position. She was his tenant. She was on his land. The power differential was real, and she had learned, in the hardest possible way, what it felt like when a man used the fact of your dependence against you. She would not put herself in that position again. She needed to be certain, absolutely certain, that what she felt building between them was mutual and honest, and not something she was projecting out of loneliness or gratitude or proximity. She watched, therefore. She paid close attention. Not with suspicion. Matthew Dawson had given her no reason for suspicion, but with the care of a woman who had earned the right to trust her own observations. What she observed, over the long, warm weeks of June and into July, was this: he fixed things. Not just on the cabin, he fixed them for her. When she mentioned the handle on the water bucket was loose, it was repaired the next morning before she asked again. When she said she'd seen a fox circling the chicken coop she had established in the corner of the barn, he spent an afternoon reinforcing the wire with a thoroughness that went beyond what the foxes warranted. He listened when she talked. Not with the performative attention of a man waiting for his turn, with actual listening, the kind where the thoughts behind his eyes were clearly engaged, processing what she said, turning it over. He sometimes responded a full minute after she'd said something, which had startled her at first and now she recognized as the habit of a man who thinks before he speaks. He was careful with her. Not in a way that was protective to the point of being smothering. He never made her feel handled or weak or in need of management. He was careful in the way that said, "I have noticed that you are someone worth being careful with." She let herself feel it. She let herself feel the warm current that ran through her when she heard the sound of Jefferson's hooves coming up the trail in the early morning. She let herself feel the specific sweetness of the moments when they were working side by side and his shoulder brushed hers, and neither of them moved away. She was careful with it. She did not let it get ahead of itself, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. One evening in mid-July, the storm that had been building all afternoon finally broke. A great rolling wall of thunder and lightning coming up from the south, with the sudden velocity that Great Plains storms achieved. Lucy had been in the garden when she saw it coming and had gotten inside with minutes to spare, and Matthew had been at the cabin, helping her mend a section of the garden fence that the chickens had been escaping through. He didn't leave. The rain came down in sheets that made the windows white with water, and the thunder was the kind that shook the floor, and they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table with the lamp lit against the sudden dark and drank coffee and talked. And the talking was different from the usual kind, looser, more direct. The constraint of perfect composure softened by the intimacy of being confined together by weather. It was during this storm that Lucy told him about Frank Harlow. She hadn't planned to, but the conversation had moved in a direction she hadn't navigated it, and she found herself saying more than she'd intended about Redding's Crossing, and about what the 14 months there had been like, and then it was simpler to tell the whole of it than to explain the partial version. Matthew listened without interruption. His face was very still. His hands, which had been wrapped around his coffee cup, were still too. She watched his eyes go through several things, understanding and something darker, and then a careful, deliberate settling into a kind of quietude that she recognized as the look of a man controlling a strong reaction because he has decided the moment calls for steadiness rather than heat. When she finished, he said, "This man is in prison now." "Yes," she said. "He will be for some time." "Good," he said. The single word was quiet and final and carried, underneath it, the suggestion of what he would feel about the matter if the man were not in prison. "It's over," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not telling you because it's still happening. I'm telling you because," she paused, finding the right shape for what she meant, "because I wanted you to know the whole shape of the person you've been spending your mornings with." He looked at her steadily. "The whole shape of that person," he said, "is someone who got through something very bad and came out the other side with her sense of herself intact. That's not a small thing." Lucy looked down at her coffee cup. "I wasn't always sure I would," she said. "I know," he said. "That's also not a small thing. The not being sure and doing it anyway." The storm rolled on outside. The lamp flame shifted. She looked up at him, and he was looking back at her with the gray eyes fully present, not distant at all. And she felt the thing between them with a clarity that was almost frightening, the honest weight of it, the mutual nature of it, the way it had been building for weeks out of every morning and every repair and every silence and every small exchange until now it was sitting openly on the table between them, undeniable as weather. She said, "Matthew." "I know," he said, "just that. I know." "What are we doing?" she asked, because she needed to hear him say it. She needed to hear his version of it clearly in words. He was quiet for a long time, which was his way, and she waited because she had learned that his silences were not evasions. "I think," he said carefully, "that I've been finding reasons to come to this cabin every morning because I want to be near you. And I think I've been pretending to myself that those reasons were practical ones because I wasn't sure what to do with the other kind." "And now?" she asked. "And now I'm telling you," he said. She held his gaze. "I appreciate it when things are said plainly," she said. "I don't do well with things that are implied and never said." "I understand that," he said. "I'll be plain, I care for you. I've been caring for you since approximately the third morning, when I watched you level a fence post with more precision than most of my hands can manage, and I decided I wasn't going to admit it to myself." A slight movement at the corner of his mouth, which was about as much of a smile as Matthew Dawson produced in the early stages of anything. "I'm admitting it now." Lucy was quiet for a moment, holding the warmth of those words very carefully. "I care for you too," she said. "I want to be honest about the fact that I've been careful about it. I've had reason to be careful about," she gestured in a way that encompassed the cabin, the land, the arrangement. "About being in a position of dependence on a man." "That's fair," he said without any defensiveness at all. "I don't think you're that kind of man," she said. "I've been watching, I'm quite good at watching, and I don't think you are, but I needed to say it." "It needed to be said," he agreed. "So," she said, "we'll go carefully." "Yes," he said, "carefully." The storm continued for another hour. They sat at the table and talked, really talked, the way they hadn't quite allowed themselves to before, because allowing it would have been an acknowledgement of what they were doing. And the conversation ranged widely, covering ground they had been circling for weeks. They talked about what they wanted from the years ahead. She wanted stability, a place that was genuinely hers, work that used her capacities, the chance to build something that couldn't be taken away. He wanted, when he was honest about it, the particular kind of company that made the silence mean something, rather than just being the absence of sound. When the storm finally blew through and the evening settled into a wet, glittering calm, he stood at the door to leave, and they stood close enough that she could have reached out her hand and not quite touched his arm. "I'll come tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. He rode home under a sky full of washed stars, and the grass smelled of rain, and Jefferson moved with the easy confidence of a horse who knows his way home in the dark. And Matthew Dawson rode the whole 3 miles back to his main house, carrying something in his chest that he had not felt in 4 years. A dangerous warmth, a terrifying tenderness. And he let himself feel it because he had told her he would be careful, and being careful was not the same as being closed. August was the month that tested the careful part. It was also the month that Hector came out to the cabin, announcing his arrival with a shout from the fence post so as not to surprise anyone, and met Lucy in person. He was a stout, brown-skinned man with a white mustache and the deliberate authority of someone who has been the functional keeper of a household for 30 years and knows it. He looked Lucy over with the same thoroughness with which he might evaluate a new horse, and then he nodded in what she recognized as approval. "He's been cheerful," Hector told her, in the conversational tone of someone imparting information he finds remarkable. "Not loud cheerful, just less like he's waiting for something to go wrong." "Is that unusual?" Lucy asked. "Extremely," Hector said. He stayed for lunch and then spent an hour in her kitchen garden telling her which plants needed more water and which were being overwatered, and she found him both useful and deeply entertaining, and when he left she felt, in a way she hadn't entirely expected, like she had passed some kind of examination that mattered. The test in August came from a different direction. A man named Robert Vale rode through from the east, a cattle buyer who had business with Matthew and who stayed 2 nights at the main house. He rode out with Matthew one afternoon to look at the property's south pasture, and they came past the cabin, and Vale saw Lucy in the garden and reined up. Vale was the type who assumed that a woman on a man's land was subject to a man's authority over her, and who would make this assumption transparently, and without any apparent awareness that it was an assumption. He spoke about the cabin's rental arrangement in terms that implied Matthew's right to decide her situation, over her head, in her presence, as though she were a piece of furniture under discussion. Lucy set down her hoe and looked at Vale with a patience that was entirely deliberate. "The arrangement is between me and Mr. Dawson," she said, calmly and clearly. "I've found it satisfactory. If you have concerns about the property, you're welcome to discuss them with the property owner." Vale looked at her with a flicker of surprise. Then he looked at Matthew. Matthew's face was perfectly composed, but his eyes had gone to a particular stillness that she had learned to read. "Mrs. Keller manages her own affairs," he said. His tone was casual and completely final. "She's been a considerable improvement to the cabin's condition, which had been neglected too long." Vale reassessed the situation rapidly and changed his tone to something more respectful, and the conversation moved on. And later, when Vale had ridden back toward the main house and Matthew lingered, Lucy looked at him with something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. "Thank you," she said. "Nothing to thank," he said. "You handled it yourself. You backed me up. That's different from handling it for you." She looked at him for a long moment. The August light was very bright and warm, and his face was open in a way it hadn't been on that first evening when he'd come to the door with his fist still raised, and she thought about how much had changed in the distance between those 2 moments, and she felt the warmth of it move through her all the way down. "Matthew," she said. "Yes. Come to supper tonight. Not to work, just supper." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." He came at 6, when the day's heat had started to soften, and she had made a proper meal: roasted chicken from one of her own birds, biscuits, green beans from the garden, a small jar of the peach preserves she had made from the wild peaches that grew along the creek. She had put the wildflowers on the table, and she had changed her dress. She had not worn the gray dress. The dress she wore was dark blue, which she had bought in Millhaven in July and had kept in the chest because she hadn't been sure she was ready for it, and then had put on tonight because she was sure. It was the blue of deep water, and it fit well, and when she saw Matthew's face when he came through the door, she felt certain she had made the right decision. He stopped in the doorway for just a moment. His expression did something complex and then settled into something that made her breath catch. "You look well," he said, which was Matthew Dawson's version of a great deal more than those 3 words. "Thank you," she said. "Sit down." The supper was the best meal either of them had eaten in a long time, which had something to do with the food, and more to do with the fact of 2 people being honestly and openly in each other's company for the first time, without the working pretense or the careful management of what they were admitting. They talked and laughed. Matthew's laugh was infrequent and therefore valuable, a real sound, sudden and warm, and the evening went long past when either of them had meant it to, until the moon was up and the coyotes were singing their strange harmonies out in the grassland. He stayed until 10. He left before 11. He paused at the door and she stood close, and he reached out and very gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and she held completely still under the touch, And then he lowered his hand and looked at her with the gray eyes very warm and said good night and walked to his horse. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, as she always did. And this time when she turned back into the cabin, she was smiling in a way that felt foreign in her face because it had been so long, a smile with nothing careful in it at all. September arrived with a turn in the temperature, the first suggestions of autumn in the morning air, and the relationship between Lucy Keller and Matthew Dawson arrived alongside it at something that could no longer be described as anything other than courtship, which was a word neither of them was using yet, but which described exactly what was happening. He rode with her to Millhaven on supply days, and they ate at the small restaurant attached to the Red Drum Saloon. Decent food, good coffee, the town watching them with friendly and comprehensive interest. Berta Walsh asked Lucy pointed questions with a warmth that softened the points. Cora Weston saw them together on the street and gave Matthew a long, approving look that he affected not to notice. He held her hand once, on the way back from Millhaven, when her horse shied at a jackrabbit, and he reached out automatically and caught her horse's bridle, and then kept his hand on hers on the reins for a moment longer than the horse's alarm required. Neither of them said anything about it, but she kept the feeling of it carefully in some interior pocket for a long time after. The first time he kissed her was in early October. They had been walking the fence line together. He was showing her the winter preparations he was making on the property, which she had asked about with practical curiosity, and they stopped to look out at the land from a rise that gave a long view to the south, the autumn grass in its dry gold, the sky the particular deep blue that only comes in autumn at elevation, and he said her name, just Lucy, and when she turned he was close and he kissed her very simply and honestly. And she kissed him back with all the warmth she had been holding carefully for months. It was not a long kiss. It was, however, a complete one, and when they separated she kept her eyes closed for a moment and felt the October air on her face and thought, there it is then. I've been wanting to do that since approximately the storm, he said. I know, she said. I was waiting for you to. You could have done it yourself, he pointed out. I could have, she agreed. I was letting you come to it in your own time. He looked at her with the warm version of his gray eyes. Is there anything you don't think about with complete deliberateness? Very little, she said honestly. I find it safer. He understood what she meant. He reached out and touched her cheek with the back of his hand, gently, briefly. You can afford to be a little less careful now, he said, if you want to be. I know, she said. I'm learning that. The autumn deepened, and with it the relationship deepened, and with the deepening came the particular intimacy of two people who have decided to be truly known to each other. She told him things she had not told anyone, not the events of her life, which she had been increasingly forthcoming about, but the inside of it, the fears and hopes and the specific texture of her losses. He did the same, with the slower and more careful cadence of a man who had not spoken these things aloud in years. He told her about the weeks after Clara died. He told her about the emptiness of the house that had once been full, the way he had gone through the motions of the work, because the work was the only thing that didn't require him to feel anything at all. He told her about selling the northern property and coming south, and how part of the reason he had never hired a live-in hand again was that having someone in the cabin would have made the land feel occupied and alive again, and he hadn't wanted it to feel that way, because feeling that way was the precondition for loss. And now? Lucy asked. She was sitting across from him in the main house kitchen. She had come for supper, which had become a regular arrangement, and the fire was going against the October cold. And now the land feels alive, he said. He said it simply as a statement of fact. And I have decided that I was wrong before about what that means. What does it mean? She asked. It means it's worth something, he said. Even knowing it could be lost, it's still worth more than the alternative. She looked at him across the kitchen table and thought, this man has fought himself to get to this place, has fought the very reasonable fear of being hurt again and come out the other side of it, and is sitting here telling me so in his honest, careful, deliberate way, and I love him. The thought arrived without warning and with complete certainty. She sat with it for a moment, feeling its weight and shape, and then she let it settle where it had arrived and recognized it as true. She did not say it that night. It was too new, too fresh, and she wanted to be certain as a person can be about such things before she offered it to him. She gave it time. She watched it to make sure it was what she thought it was. She was thorough about everything. She was sure by November. November in the high plains was the beginning of real cold, the kind that had teeth, that made the morning sky a hard, bright blue and sent the cattle down to the sheltered draws and frosted the water in the well bucket overnight. Lucy had laid in her winter supplies with the same meticulous preparation she brought to everything, and the cabin was snug and warm, the firewood stacked well past the height of the window outside the north wall. She told him on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter, and the first snow of the season was 3 hours away. She told him simply and directly because that was how she did things. "I love you," she said. "I wanted to tell you." They were standing in the barn where she had been feeding the horses, and he had come to tell her about a section of fence that needed attention before the snow, and he went very still when she said it, the way he went still when something important had happened and he was organizing himself around it. "Lucy," he said. "You don't have to say it back right now," she said. "I just needed to say it. I'm fairly certain it's mutual, and I didn't want to wait any longer." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the short distance between them in the barn and took her face in both his hands and kissed her with a fullness and warmth that answered the question completely. And when he pulled back, he said, quietly and with great seriousness, "I love you. I have loved you since before I was ready to, and I have been grateful every single morning since you put that key in my hand and refused to move." She laughed against his chest. "I didn't refuse. I was negotiating. You were staying," he said, "and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life." The snow came that evening, as predicted, and by morning it had laid a white blanket over the entire property. The cabin and the main house and the barns and the fences and the garden all made pristine and equal under it, and the world was very quiet. He asked her to marry him in December. It was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. He had not set a scene or prepared a speech. He had thought about it very seriously for several weeks, which was his way, and he had talked to Hector, who had expressed such thunderous approval that Matthew had needed to actually tell him to calm down. And then one evening when they were sitting together in the main house after supper, the fire going and the snow outside and the room feeling more occupied than it had in years, he said, "I'd like you to marry me, Lucy, if you're willing." She had put down her cup and looked at him, and there were things moving behind her eyes that he waited for. "I want to be very sure," she said. "Not about you. I'm certain about you. I want to be sure that what I'm building with you is mine, properly mine in a way that the law recognizes. That's not a romantic thing to say." "No," he said, "it's a practical one and a reasonable one. I would want the deed to the cabin in my name," she said, "just the cabin and its immediate land so that I have something that is specifically mine." He didn't hesitate. "Done. And I would want us to be equals," she said, "in how we make decisions." "I would want that too," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I'll marry you, Matthew." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat quietly together while the fire went through its evening business of settling and shifting, and outside the snow glittered in the moonlight, and inside the house there was the specific warmth of two people who have both been through enough to know what warmth costs and have chosen it anyway. They married in February of 1884, in the small church in Millhaven, with Hector as witness and Berta Walsh and Cora Weston and Dottie Park in the first row, and the circuit minister performing a service that was brief and genuine. Lucy wore a dress of deep green that she had made herself over the winter, and Matthew wore his good suit and looked at her while she walked toward him with the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised that his life turned out this way and started simply being grateful for it. The weather outside was bitter and bright, the sky the hard January blue that had no end to it, and the church was small and packed with Millhaven residents who had taken considerable collective interest in this development. And the minister said the words that made it legal and real, and Matthew put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, which Hector had produced from a box in the back of a kitchen drawer with the air of a man who had been waiting for the right occasion. They said "I do" simultaneously, which hadn't been planned but which made Berta Walsh cry. After the ceremony, the town gathered in the Red Drum's dining room, which Berta and the saloon owner had arranged together, and there was food and fiddle music and considerable goodwill, and Cora Weston made a toast that was, coming from Cora, effusively warm, which meant it was two sentences, both honest and both kind, and it was the best toast of the evening. Lucy danced with Matthew twice, which he did with the careful sincerity of a man who is not entirely confident about dancing, but is committed to the attempt, and she found both the effort and the occasional stumble completely endearing. They rode home to the main house together in the February cold, under a sky full of stars, Jefferson and her bay horse moving companionably side by side on the familiar trail. The house was lit when they arrived. Hector had gone ahead and started fires in every room, a gesture of such straightforward love that Lucy had to blink when she stepped inside. "Welcome home," Hector said with dignity, and then went to bed. Lucy stood in the main house kitchen, which was now also her kitchen, looking at the room with the eyes of a woman who has come a very long way to stand in this particular place, and she felt the completeness of the moment with every part of her. Matthew came and stood beside her. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the lit kitchen while the cold pressed at the windows, and it was the most at home she had felt since before James died, and possibly more than that, a different kind of home, built on firmer ground, on the knowledge of what she could survive and who she was and what she had chosen and been chosen by. "I like this house," she said. "It likes you," he said. "It's been waiting for someone to use it properly." She laughed and looked up at him. Like the cabin," he agreed and kissed her. Spring came again, as it does, with the determination of a thing that cannot be stopped. The 1884 spring came up through the prairie in waves of green and wildflower color, the meadowlarks returning to their stations on the fence posts, the cottonwood trees filling in along the creek with their trembling new leaves. Lucy had moved her things to the main house in stages over the winter, but she kept the cabin with equal care. Because it was hers, the deed had been transferred as Matthew had promised, without ceremony, the morning after he'd proposed, with the same directness that characterized everything about him. She thought about renting it out, but for now she kept it. She liked knowing it was there. There was something in the shape of the place, the particular quality of its mornings with the light coming in the south window, that she wasn't ready to share with anyone else yet. She and Matthew worked the ranch together through that spring, and it was good, not easy, because ranch work is not easy, but satisfying in the way that real work always is. She had a talent for the operations organizational side, which Matthew had been managing by habit and instinct, and which she approached with a precision that improved several processes without making him feel managed. He worked the land and cattle with the fluency of his long experience. They complemented each other in ways that neither had predicted and both appreciated. In May, Lucy discovered she was expecting a child. She told Matthew on a Tuesday morning while they were drinking coffee on the porch, in the manner she had developed for important information, directly, clearly, without elaborate staging. He set down his cup very carefully. He turned and looked at her. His face went through 3 or 4 things rapidly, and then settled on something so open and unguarded that she felt her throat tighten. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I'm thorough," she said. "Yes." He reached out and took her hand and held it between both of his and looked at her with the gray eyes full of something that she understood completely, because it was the same thing she was feeling, a great, overwhelming wave of joy that was also threaded through with the knowledge of everything they had each lost, and the courage it took to let this new thing be real, to let themselves have it fully. "I'm very glad," he said. "I am too," she said. "I'm also a little frightened." "So am I," he said. "We'll be frightened together." "That sounds right," she said. Hector, when informed, sat down in a kitchen chair and covered his face with his hands for a full minute before removing them and announcing that the child would obviously need a proper upbringing, and he personally would see to the cooking. Cora Weston, when informed in Millhaven on the next supply trip, clapped both hands on Lucy's shoulders and looked at her with a ferocity of feeling that was Cora's version of throwing her arms around someone and weeping with joy. "Good," she said, with enormous emphasis. "Very good." Berta Walsh did actually weep briefly, and then apologized for it while continuing to do it. The summer was warm, and the pregnancy progressed without serious complication, which Lucy accepted with her usual combination of gratitude and preparedness. She had read everything she could find on the subject, had communicated with the circuit doctor during his visits, had arranged for a midwife from a settlement 12 miles east to come when the time was near. She worked the ranch through July with modifications, and let Matthew hover with approximately 40% of the frequency he wanted to and 100% of the discretion, which she appreciated. He was careful with her in the new way that the pregnancy had created, not smothering, not treating her like she was fragile, but present, attentive, bringing her water without being asked, sitting close in the evenings, holding her hand with a regularity that had become the private language between them. She loved him with a completeness that still sometimes surprised her, not in its existence, which she had been sure of for months, but in its depth, which kept revealing new levels. She was in the kitchen in early November when the first pains began, and she made her way to the bedroom with total composure, sent Matthew for the midwife with clear, unhurried instructions, and then engaged in the difficult business of childbirth with the same thorough, methodical determination she brought to everything. The baby arrived on a cold November morning in 1884, approximately 9 months and 2 weeks after the wedding, which caused Berta Walsh to do quick mental arithmetic and then decide not to share the result with anyone. It was a boy. A solid, dark-haired boy who announced himself to the world with considerable volume and looked at the room with eyes that were, in the first moments, the unfocused deep blue of all newborns, and Matthew held him with the profound, terrified gentleness of a man who has never been so careful with anything in his life. They named him James. Lucy's choice, offered tentatively, accepted by Matthew immediately and without any trace of anything except sincerity. "Are you sure?" she asked. "We can. James is a good name," he said. He was looking at the baby. "It's a name worth carrying forward." She looked at her husband and her son and felt the full, complicated, beautiful weight of what it was to be alive and to have built something real, and she let herself have it without qualification. James Dawson grew into a fat, cheerful infant who regarded the world with enormous interest, and whose first clear sound, aside from crying, was a kind of focused, moo noise he made when regarding the chickens from the safety of the porch, and who, by the spring of 1885, was pulling himself upright on the furniture and looking at things he was not supposed to touch with a calculating expression that made Lucy say, with conviction, that he was going to be exactly like his father. Matthew's response to this was that he was exactly like his mother, and the argument was never settled because neither of them were wrong. Hector became, effectively, a third grandparent, a role he occupied with such thoroughness that Matthew was occasionally genuinely uncertain who was running the household. James adored Hector with the pure, uncomplicated love of a very small person for someone who always has food and never says no to an extra biscuit. The cabin sat in its meadow at the edge of the property, well maintained and used for storage and occasional purposes, and Lucy walked out to it sometimes in the evenings when the light was right, the way you might visit a place that was significant to your history. She would stand in the doorway the way she had stood that first evening with the cast-iron skillet in her hand, and she would look at the big house 3 miles away where the lights were coming on in the windows, and she would think about the version of herself who had arrived here with a broken wagon lock and a list of repairs and a stubborn refusal to be told to leave. She was grateful to that woman. She thought it was important to be. In the spring of 1886, when James was 16 months old and beginning to have very strong opinions about which direction he wanted to be carried, Lucy discovered she was expecting again. She told Matthew in the same way she had told him the first time, coffee on the porch, Tuesday morning, directly. He looked at her with a smile that was not his usual restrained partial smile, but a full, unguarded one that she saw rarely enough that it always made her feel like a door had opened somewhere. When? He asked. November, I think, near to James's birthday. Hector will want to plan a combined celebration, Matthew said. Hector will plan several separate celebrations and be extremely organized about all of them, Lucy said. This was entirely accurate. The second baby was also a boy, arriving in October rather than November, a little ahead of expectation and with considerable urgency, and was named Thomas after Matthew's father, which had been Matthew's suggestion, and which Lucy seconded with her whole heart. Thomas was smaller at birth than James had been, and fiercer, and made his preferences known with a comprehensiveness that suggested a very clear sense of what he was owed by the world. He's magnificent, Lucy said, from the complete exhaustion of having just delivered him. He's terrifying, Matthew said, equally fond. Hector met Thomas with the gravity of a man welcoming a new commander and immediately began the process of determining his food preferences, which were as yet limited but clearly already strong. The ranch grew through the late 1880s in the way that ranches grow when they are managed by people who understand both the land and the work, steadily, without drama, with consistent attention to what matters and the willingness to adapt when conditions change. Matthew brought on 2 hands who worked days from Millhaven, and Lucy managed the books and the supply operations with an efficiency that saved them money in ways she cataloged, and he trusted entirely. They talked about everything, every decision, every plan, every problem, because that was the arrangement they had made and both kept. Cora Weston became one of Lucy's closest friends, which suited both of them because they were similarly blunt and similarly practical and similarly uninterested in performing warmth they didn't feel. Their friendship was the kind built on honesty and the occasional exchange of very dry observations about the world, which both of them found more sustaining than sentiment. Berta Walsh threw a party when James walked his first independent steps in the general store on a supply trip, which was not strictly necessary but which made James very happy, because Berta gave him a piece of peppermint candy, and from that point forward, he associated the general store with magic. The years moved with the quality that good years have, full enough that they weren't slow, ordered enough that the fullness didn't become chaos. Lucy planted her kitchen garden every spring and put up preserves every summer and fed her family through every winter, and took deep satisfaction in all of it, not because it was what she had been told to want, but because she had chosen it freely, with full knowledge of herself and her alternatives. She thought about James, her first husband, without the weight of guilt she had carried for a while, the strange guilt of loving again after loss, as though love were a finite supply that could be depleted by use. She had come to understand that it was not. She carried James Keller with her as she had always carried him in the place where honest things live, and she carried Matthew Dawson in every breath she took, and every morning she woke to find him beside her, and neither carrying diminished the other. She thought about Harlow occasionally, in the way you think about a thing that was very bad and is now well over. He was in prison. He would be for some time. She did not wish him dead. She was not built for that kind of ongoing anger, but she was grateful for the wall between her present and what he had made of her past, and she was grateful always for Abe Collins and his surveyor's eye and his sister's history that had made him look at the records. The frontier was changing around them as the decade closed. The railroad was coming, eventually, to the region. The talk of it was everywhere in Millhaven, the anticipation and the anxiety about what it would mean for the way things had been done. New settlers were arriving with greater frequency, the open land being staked and claimed in pieces, the great emptiness of the plains becoming something more mapped and less wild with each passing season. Matthew watched these changes with the measured attention he gave to everything, neither resisting nor rushing to embrace. He talked to Lucy about it, what they wanted the ranch to look like in 10 years, in 20, what they were building for and who they were building it for. The conversations were long and careful, and he always listened when she talked, and she always listened when he talked, and their conclusions were always ones they had reached together. It was on an autumn evening in 1889 that they sat together on the porch of the main house, James and Thomas in their beds. The ranch settled around them in the blue-gray dusk, and Matthew reached over and took her hand the way he had been taking her hand for years, with the uncalculated ease of someone doing something that has become as natural as breathing. "Do you remember the first evening?" he asked. She looked at him. "When you came to the cabin." "When I came to the cabin," he said. "Ready to throw you out and feeling very righteous about it," she laughed. "You knocked very hard. I thought you'd be—" He paused, searching for the word. "Someone different. What were you expecting?" "Someone who would argue or plead or cry," he said. "Someone who'd make it dramatic." He turned his head to look at her. "You handed me a key." "I was negotiating," she said, as she always had. "You were," he agreed. He laced his fingers through hers. "I've been grateful for it every day since." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the land that was his by inheritance and hers by love, and James Dawson's and Thomas Dawson's by birthright, the land that stretched away from them in the twilight in every direction, lit by the last of the October sun in its long, particular gold. "So have I," she said. The stars came up one by one while they sat there, as they had come up over this land for longer than any of them had been here and would come up long after, and the night settled around the house and the cabin at the edge of the property, and the fence lines and the creek and the cattle and the draws. And inside the house Hector moved through the kitchen on his evening routines, and upstairs the two boys slept with the absolute surrender of childhood. And on the porch Matthew and Lucy Dawson sat together in the early dark and held hands and were entirely, completely, finally home. There was, in the end, nothing hidden between them. No secrets that festered, no motives that went unexamined, no parts of themselves that were forbidden from the shared knowledge of the other. They had each been through enough to understand what that kind of honesty cost and to pay it without hesitation, because the alternative, the closed doors, the managed distances, the small daily betrayals of withholding, was a price they had both paid before and had no intention of paying again. This was what they had built, out of a broken lock and a cast iron skillet, and a woman who refused to be told to leave, and a man who came to object and stayed to help her unpack, and out of the long, careful weeks of coffee and repairs and the gradual, fearless opening of two people who had both been hurt badly and had chosen, in full knowledge of the risk, to trust again. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of life that people who haven't had to fight for it sometimes take for granted, and that people who have fought know the exact specific value of, and treasure accordingly. James Dawson grew into a boy who was curious and steady, and who learned carpentry from his mother at age 7. And Thomas Dawson grew into a child of absolute determination, who learned to ride before he could reliably walk in a straight line. Hector outlived everyone's expectations and continued to run the kitchen on his own terms until he was comfortably into his 70s, at which point he announced he was retired, and then continued doing exactly what he had always done, but on a slightly adjusted schedule. Cora Weston and Lucy Keller Dawson remained friends for the rest of their long lives, and their friendship remained built on honesty and the exchange of dry observations, which neither of them ever stopped finding more sustaining than sentiment, and which sustained them both very well. The cabin at the edge of the property stood solid and well-maintained for decades, the mortar in the chimney flashing renewed when necessary, the window latch on the south side kept in good working order, the well rope replaced before it ever went fully frayed again. It stood as witness to the fact that a woman with a list and a determination not to be moved, and a man who came out ready to object and found himself, against all his careful defenses, unable to leave, that such a beginning was possible and real, and could grow into something that held against everything the years might send its way. Which it did, which it had, which it would continue to do, across the wide open land, in the particular reliable light of high plains mornings, for a very long time to come.